Welcome to Unashamed, Unafraid, a show unashamed about sexual addiction recovery and unafraid of coming unto Christ for healing.
Where we talk about real recovery stories, answer anonymous questions, and share resources that actually work.
I'm your host, Chris.
And I'm your co-host, James, and we are Unashamed, Unafraid. Chris.
Yes, sir.
So we got Chris and Sarah to join us for our podcast today.
Not me, Chris, a different Chris.
Right. This was a different Chris. Chris only has one wife, that's Autumn. But we have a different Chris, and his wife Sarah joined us today.
And we don't have Steve today.
Nope, it's just you and I today, Chris. So Steve is doing facilitating a group therapy, so he couldn't be here. And frankly, you and I know our guests better anyway. We went to dinner with them,
absolutely.
So felt like it would be more appropriate to have you and I do the interview with them today.
Yep, and I loved it. It was awesome.
So what stood out to you, Chris?
What really stood out to me was the point that he changed his perspective of God. Mm-hmm. He had that experience that you guys will hear where he was going to baptize his son, and waited the last minute. First he was like, atheist or agnostic, and he just didn't know if that was something that he wanted to do. And the day of, he was like, "Oh yeah, I want to baptize my son," and she was like, "Nope, you're not going to. You didn't take the time to try to even connect with God on this and come get an answer on whether or not you should do this." And she, kind of put her foot down, which first of all is amazing that she was able to even do that.
Yeah. That's some courage.
But then that he, at first it hurt him, but then he totally changed because of that moment.
Right.
And he threw the shovel away at that point and quit digging. He was like, "This is my rock bottom." And he talks about that. Yeah. I love that.
Yeah. And, I really appreciated in the bonus content, Sarah has had some trauma in her past, and she kind of talks about what it's been like to have Chris, as he's been able to fight for her heart, really created the space for her to begin to heal and face her own traumas. Stuff that she just kind of felt like she had to put on the back burner and couldn't really work through those until Chris really started to show up for her.
Right.
And fight for her heart. And so I really love that. So you outsiders are in for a treat there.
I think that's it. I think we jump right into the episode.
Okay. With that, let's jump in and we'll join Chris and Sarah. Chris, Sarah, it's great to have you here with us. Thanks for joining us. Chris Ashworth, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, I just turned 40. I grew up in St. George. I'm an electrical engineer. I went to BYU. I went on a mission, and I'm...
A mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
That's right. I went to South Korea. That's right.
Awesome.
2-year mission. I'm still converting. Still in that process, and it's been a very recent and powerful process, and just in the last 3 months. And I'm also a recovering addict, all sorts of things. So,
okay. Well, why don't you let's dive into that a little bit. Tell us a little bit about maybe what type of home you were raised in, just briefly, and kind of what brought you. How you were introduced to your addiction, and maybe end off with kind of what the height of that addiction looked like. Maybe a little, and we'll kind of ask you questions along the way.
Sure. I was raised in a 2-parent home. I'm the oldest of 4 kids, and I was raised in a very happy home. When Sarah and I were getting married, I told her, "Come meet my family. That they're amazing. Just come in." I hadn't been through therapy yet, and I'm nothing negative about my family, but I just hadn't seen all the culture, all the things that got in the way and contributed to my addiction. So I grew up in what I can, a very happy home. My parents love each other. They're still married. They've fought through a lot of hard things, and there's still some hard things there. But they are together and they love each other. It's a big deal. That's a good foundation for me.
So when did your addiction start for you then?
Yeah, when I was, coming into puberty, it was about 12 years old. So I struggled with an addiction to pornography and masturbation regularly from about 12 years old to 26. And that started just slowly, over weeks. I would act out every few weeks at first. And over the months and years, it became much more frequent. I would find, material to look at, in all sorts of places. But I think masturbation as the root, just wanting that, the emotional whatever that comes from that. Whenever I would ejaculate, like that was just I would walk away from it after that, right? But as I got more and more into it, I would prolong that and look longer and longer. So it changed that way over the years.
Yeah. So prior to meeting Sarah, had you really told anybody about any of this, or talked to anybody about it, or sought for help?
Sure. Yeah. I lied to a number of bishops, and that's been a big thing for me to own. I lied to a lot of people about it. Did I tell anybody about it? I told a few bishops about it. I told a bishop right before my mission. And that was a big experience we could talk about more later if you want to. And I confessed to a mission president, while I was out, and then a couple more bishops after my mission. And finally, I turned the corner when I finally talked to a counselor and faced acting out again. There's a lot more to talk about there.
Okay.
And then for you, Sarah, what was it like for you growing up in the home that you grew up in? And
yeah, my home is interesting. The positives are that my mother loved me, and I felt that, and she listened to me. And then also I grew up in a home with a lot of socioeconomic privilege. So those are the strengths. But there were a lot of drawbacks. Both of my parents worked, and I was raised by nannies. And then there were a lot of problems there. My parents also divorced when I was 9 years old, and there were a lot of problems there. And then there was a lot of abuse and also complete disconnection. Like, I guess I had some connection to my mom and one sibling, but other than that, we avoided each other as much as possible. So.
And that's just that was the family atmosphere, or was that because of tension that was going on between parents, or?
I think, what was it? My mom was wounded and she worked 60 hours a week.
Emotionally wounded
from my parents' divorce. My sisters had some mental health issues. So it was a really unpleasant place to be. Yeah. So I think we all just kind of avoided each other as much as possible in order to live our own lives. So for me, a lot of my family experience was actually through friends at school, because that's where I could connect to people.
Okay.
So in the description stuff that you sent over to us before, Chris, you talked about an experience that you had when you were 16. that you remember feeling the spirit of at church one day. Do you remember talking about that?
Yeah, I do.
So if you can expound on that, I actually highlighted that because I was like, that's kind of a lot of addicts will go through that, and I just wanted you to kind of expand on that and what that was like for you and what the overall experience was for you.
Okay, yeah. So the addiction cycle I went through many times, and many times more than I needed to, because I never reached out, or very, very rarely reached out. And just one example of that was when I was about 16 years old. I remember being at church in sacrament meeting and having a good experience and being like, wow, this, God is with me. I don't know if I even felt that, but I felt resolved. I felt supported and comforted, and I felt resolved that I would never act out again. It had been 4 years. And I felt determined at that time. But man, I got home from church, and half an hour later, I was on the computer, looking at pornography.
And that just blows me away that and we've all done that. We're like, oh, you know what? I'm in this holiday or today's the last day I'm going to do this. I'm never going to do this again. And then within minutes, or like yours was 30 minutes later, you're like right back into it. The adversary just knows how to work his way into our lives in such a quick manner.
Right.
He's like, nope, I'm not going to let him change yet.
Yeah. And he'll work his way to dismantle that as quickly as possible, as you know. So, you talked about church a little bit. So both of you, I just want to ask you, what was your relationship or your perspective about God like as a youth and as a teen and maybe even young adult? Kind of, who was God to you? And tell me about that relationship a little bit.
You want to start? Well, for me, and actually, can I add a piece onto what I said before?
Absolutely.
Yep.
So I was abused by, I think it's 6 different people. I kind of lose count. And so I think, and then my sisters.
Sexually, physically, emotionally, tell me. I mean, we don't need to go into details, but just.
A lot of emotional abuse, some neglect, some physical abuse, but it wasn't constant. And then there was a lot of sexual trauma.
Okay.
That's the best way to describe it.
Okay.
And so I grew up with that. And I think my sisters have their own stories as well. And so I think that also contributed to us each just, without any emotional support or connection, we kind of each found our own way to cope.
Right.
And went all different directions.
Okay.
Back to your question about my testimony. I was raised a member
Who
of
is God?
And who is God? Thank you. I was raised a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I would say that we didn't really practice it much in the home. I mean, kind of, like that's what we all did. But everything I learned about church came from at church. And so, but I don't know, I guess I'm a perfectionist and I follow the rules. So I was straight, and did all the things you're supposed to do. But it wasn't until, and I had spiritual experiences, but I would say God was very distant. And especially I had a very conflicted relationship with my dad. And I learned later that you project your dad onto God. And so I very much saw, like, those were kind of the same, right? I saw God as aloof and even was afraid of him, and afraid of how he would respond to me. But then in college, I went to a college that had people from all over the world. And so I was exposed to just so many different things. And I intentionally went deep with looking for what was true in the world. And that was when I think I really started to pursue God and what he wanted for me and what was real. I would say it wasn't until much later that I had a personal relationship with him, but I at least, and through therapy, started to change that perception of him, to see God as a kind.
Yeah, and we'll go there, but I wanted to, the reason I wanted to go there was to just start to, who was he then, and we'll get to who is he now. And so I just wanted to kind of give us an idea of what he was like for you. Chris, why don't you tell us what was your perspective of God, and who was he to you too?
Yep. I didn't think much about who God was. I thought more about church and being worthy.
And checking the boxes, right? And doing all the rules. Okay.
Yeah. And I would pray sometimes, but it was always, but it wasn't trying to pray to a person, or visualizing a father. So I would say, I think addiction particularly kept me pretty numb and distracted from really going there in any meaningful way, into who God is or trying to connect with him.
Okay.
So a lot of just church and going to church, and looking like I'm
looking like a God-fearing person or whatever, but not so much actually working on developing a relationship with deity. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would say too, just really, really quickly, I would say that I was sincere a lot of times. Like I went on a mission sincerely, and I would go to church sincerely. I didn't mean to be, didn't mean to be a rule keeper, but I didn't know differently.
Yeah. So how did you guys meet? And then once we talk, now that we're going to get into that a little bit, talk about when did she find out about your addiction? Did you just come out and tell her? Did she catch you? What was that like for you guys? So talk a little bit about that.
Okay. Yeah. How did we meet? I moved out to California after I graduated from college. And I was on the hunt, for a wife. And so I'd made a list of every girl I would meet that I was interested in. And she ended up on the top of the list. We met at a stake meeting, in the evening. I showed up late to it because there was a football game or something before. And she didn't know, but I went over and I saw her, and I was talking to the girl next to her because I knew the girl next to her, and then she turned around and I saw her face and ended the conversation with the other woman right then, and we spent the rest of the evening talking. I got her number, and we were married within 3.5 months. No, engaged within 3.5 months. Married within 7 months. So
that's awesome. And then, so did she know, before you guys got married, did she know anything about your addiction at all?
Yes. So when we were dating, and it was getting serious, I'm not even sure what stage. When we were dating, I told her about my addiction. I told her that I was addicted to pornography. I had been sober from acting out for a year or a year and a half. So I may have phrased it all in the past, but it was, I hadn't gone through deep recovery or anything, but I told her about it. You might share your reaction, but.
Yeah. Do you want to hear?
Yeah, absolutely.
That was our next question. So.
Yeah. So we've been dating, and he says that he, needs to share something with me, and it's a big deal. So I was kind of worried and wondering what was going to happen, and kind of braced for that. And then he told me, an addiction to pornography. And all I knew, especially from just hearing stuff, in young women, was that pornography was evil. It was bad. Stay away from it. Like I remember hearing that and thinking, oh my goodness, like you run from this. You don't marry this. You don't stick with this. Like you run. But what was astounding to me is that as he shared, it was a gift from God. My heart was filled with love. And I actually glimpsed or understood his heart in a way that didn't make sense. That was a gift from God. And I just felt love and compassion, and even cried for the struggle that Chris had gone through. And I remember just kind of reeling after that, thinking like, my goodness, like I feel solid love for this person. I don't feel any condemnation or fear. But can I really just keep dating or marry this person? And then I talked to my therapist, and I know now how wise she was. But she said, Sarah, you'll be hard pressed to find a man who is not, or who has not had experiences with pornography. And this man is willing to talk about it. And that will make a huge difference. And so in faith, we continued our relationship and got married.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. That's awesome.
So I'm going to assume, did you figure that marriage would fix the whole thing now that you could be sexually active?
My dad told me it would, right before we got married. He's
wow.
You've talked about being addicted, but now you're getting married, so you're going to be fine.
So everything will go away and it's all resolved.
And as we so often know, that isn't quite the case.
It's not very often that we get a parent saying that that's the case, where everybody just assumes that's the case, not having your dad be like, hey, it'll all go away.
This will all take care of it, yeah. No, so, just tell us a little bit, Chris, just tell us, what's the height of addiction for you? Or what does rock bottom look like? Where are you at? What behaviors are you participating in? What's your view of yourself, your spouse, God, those kinds of things?
Yeah. So I've had many rock bottoms, and I've had many steps out of recovery. The first one was when I was 25, and that's when I finally went to a counselor instead of a bishop. And I think I had just I was coming out of a difficult relationship, with a young woman who had told me God said that we shouldn't be dating anymore. And man, it felt like God condemning me. It felt like unworthiness, coming at me. That thing that I was trying to escape and numb from came at me pretty hard. But after a year of just dealing with that probably in a poor way, I went to a counselor, and the big deal, and I was talking to him and just talking and telling my story for the first time in my life, really just talking to somebody, and it was so good. But then I acted out again, and it was devastating to me. And I resolved, I'm never going to go see that counselor again. And that had been my pattern with bishops. I had gone and confessed to a bishop, but then I would act out again, and I would never go back to that bishop. If he asked me about how I was doing, I'd say, "Oh, I'm just doing fine. Thank you for your help, Bishop."
Right. So this was your sort of avoidance technique of ever having to be super accountable, right? You're avoiding accountability through this.
Yeah, I think I also always wanted to be separate from the addiction. I wanted to have like 3 weeks of sobriety before I would confess, right? So I could say, well, I used to be addicted, and then falling again, acting out again, breaks that
right.
image.
Yeah, so you're kind of, you're super ashamed, and it's like, yeah, I've got to be weeks out of this before I can say anything.
Yeah. But, that specific instance, I was, when I acted out, I was in New York, upstate New York for a job interview. And I drove over to the Sacred Grove because after I had acted out, I had a little extra time, and I went over there and I prayed, and I didn't have a big revelation experience, but that I really see that as a turning point. I went back to the counselor and I told him, and that's when I stopped acting out the first time. But I got enough sobriety, the sobriety that I had before I got married.
Yeah. So that's a rock bottom around 25, and you turn a corner.
Yeah.
And
yeah. So another rock bottom, I acted out again when I was about 30 years old.
So you're getting pretty long stints of sobriety in between each one of these, right?
Yeah, that was a lot of sobriety. There was a lot of sobriety, but no healing, right? And so that's what this next stage was. So I acted out. My son was 1.5 years old. I had an iPhone for the first time ever, and and he wasn't sleeping well. I wasn't sleeping well, and I made a poor choice. And I looked something up, and I masturbated, and I said, what did I just do? What did I just do? It had been 5 years, right? The first time in my marriage. And I just sat there for half an hour, like just trying to avoid it, wishing it would go away. I finally went and told my wife. And
like right after, right? Like 30 minutes
within
later?
like 30 minutes. That's huge. 30 minutes is way fast.
Some people get scared when I tell them, hey, we have a 24-hour rule in our marriage, and we have to tell within 24 hours. And the longest that I ever went was 6 hours before I told her. But I mean, you went 30 minutes. You're like, okay, I can't hold on to this.
My preference is not to say anything. So, that's the way I like to roll. Yeah. That's the way I wanted to do it when I was an addict. So,
but I can tell you, so I went and told her, and can I curse? All hell broke loose. It was big. I had not acted out before in marriage, and share your view.
Do you want to hear?
yes, sure.
I was livid. I was completely livid. And I know now that 30 minutes is great, but I didn't at the time. And I was so mad.
You're like, why did he wait so long?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm thinking like going, holy crap, 30 minutes is like amazing. And she's like flipping out. It's 30 minutes later. Why didn't he come like right after?
Exactly. And a therapist had to set me straight on that, because I was still so mad, months later. But I was mad because we were vigilant. Like every week, frequently we would check in, and how are you doing, and what do you need, and how's it going for you? And like, I was so careful. I wasn't going to walk into, what it had been like 13 years of addiction before his sobriety. And I felt like, we don't mess around with that. We're going to really stay on top of this. And then all of a sudden he's acted out. I was so mad.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the grace that God had set us up, he had led us to the house that we were living in the ward, and the bishop. And that bishop was remarkable. I went to that bishop, and he was a recent addict, he was a recovered addict. Probably 2 years before, he had described himself as a shell of a man. And now here he was as bishop, and just ready to receive me and direct me in recovery. He directed us to Lifestar, and he received my full, when I was ready, my full confession, or, whatever the list of acting out, everything I had done. Full disclosure. And I just felt like I could trust him completely, right? A lot of bishops that I wouldn't have trusted or gone back to, or anyway, he was right there ready. And that was God.
Oh, and such a grace, because I didn't know what to do. I knew we had to do something. I didn't know what. I had no clue.
Okay, so you've acted out this one time, and everybody freaks out, right? So, and then you go see the bishop, and then you're like, good, you're sober for another like 5 years, or what's next?
Yeah, I have acted out. I have acted out from a masturbation standpoint, rarely since that. But I have not been good. I have not been all good. What I've been doing, I've been acting out in other ways. I've been acting out upstream. I've been acting out.
Tell me a little bit about what you mean by upstream.
Yeah. So in Lifestar, we learned about the idea of going upstream from the addiction, and they taught us that in order to heal, you go upstream, down, the river flows downstream, and the addict is at the bottom in the pond, in the Dead Sea. But upstream is where the problems happened, the core wounding, or the stimulus even. And so the next years were, and even in the last months, we continue unpacking, that addiction. A specific example would be scanning, looking for women or
filtering. So sexual filtering.
Sexual, yeah, sure. But like I would do that. I would create a bottom line in Lifestar where I'd say, okay, a 3-second rule. If I dwell on something for 3 seconds, dwell on something sexual for 3 seconds, then I need to tell Sarah. I would slip. I'd slip regularly. But then, as we dealt with the wounds and the issues, I would slowly move that bottom line further and further. Away from addiction, further and further away from anything sexual, and it's been a wonderful process. But and so I've had people tell me, even in my Lifestar group, I had somebody turn to me and say, "You're not an addict. You're not like us." And I'm like, "Holy cow! No, I'm not acting out like you are." But I have suffered from the same wounding. I don't know God. I'm further from God than you are. That man knew God. He had a testimony and a relationship with God, and I still didn't. And I was years away from that at that time. So,
yeah. So just kind of dive into that. I think a lot of people would be like, "Yeah, this guy's not an addict." So, tell us a little bit about why you would consider yourself an addict if you don't have a major history of significant amount of acting out with masturbation or pornography.
Yeah, well, I would say I had from 12 to 25. I would act out. Once the addiction was there, I was acting out every day, sometimes for hours. Right, looking, searching, obsessing. There were stints and bouts of sobriety in there too, but mostly it was acting out.
Because from about 20 to 25, you didn't have any slips, right? Because that was that 5-year sobriety.
30.
Oh, okay, 25 to 30. Got it.
20 to 25, yeah, there was yeah.
Plenty in
There's still a lot of acting out.
Yeah. So you're talking about some other rock bottoms then. So take us a little bit on this sort of upstream journey then, and what those rock bottoms look like, and what your relationship with God has been like through this process, and what it's like now.
Let me tell you about my spiritual rock bottom. And that was probably when I was 35 or so, 36. So 6 years after starting therapy, probably 3 years after starting therapy, I saw how shallow and hollow my relationship with God had been. Like, I didn't know God. I didn't have a relationship with God. And so I decided that over a few months, and I decided that I must be either atheist or agnostic. And I never, sat on one of those titles with determination. I say, well, I just don't know, and I can't know. But if he exists, then I'm mad at him. And if he doesn't, then I'll just live my life. I've been through therapy now, but so I lived as an atheist agnostic for a few years. And my son was, again, 1.5 when I started therapy. And I'm like, oh, by the time he's 8 and ready for baptism, I'll be through this, I'll have figured things out. But no. So we get to his baptism day, and a month before he's going to be baptized, my wife felt from God. She said, Chris, I feel that if you will read the Book of Mormon every day and dedicate yourself, you can do this. I wasn't even really interested in trying. I didn't try to do it. And it just, was an open wound for a month, or an unnamed, something we didn't talk about much. But we get to my son's baptism morning, and finally I'm like, okay, I'll pray. And I feel like, oh, I got an answer. God says I can do this. So I turn to my wife, and she says, and I say, I'll do this. I've decided that I'll do it. And she says, oh no, it's too late. You have procrastinated the day of your repentance. And you had a chance, Chris. You could have done this, but you not prepare for this, and you didn't do it. So our neighbor, a man we didn't even know that well, baptized my son that day.
So what did that do to your heart when she told you that?
that hurt more than seeing somebody else baptize my son, especially because I was still agnostic. Right? I was like, I don't know what this ordinance means. I'm not all that into it anyway, but that hurt.
Did that create resentment towards Sarah, or did it, what did it do?
You say to
me?
Yeah.
Well, I think that, and I guess I would have shared that story slightly differently. But for the most part, it's true. But I think that I was acting in the right and doing a good job. But it did send him to his rock bottom. I think it made him face the reality that he was making a choice and there were consequences to that choice, to not lean in, to not do the work, to avoid it. And so at that point, I saw a huge shift in him deciding to actually face what was going on in his heart and deal with it one way or the other.
Yeah. I began reaching out to God. I began journaling, writing prayers to God. And one day he answered. It was the most incredible thing. I was writing just a prayer to God. And so many times I was angry at God. And then it felt, not even words, but I just felt a response, and I wrote it down as from him. And I ended up having a whole conversation with God that day. And it was an incredible conversation. And yet I feared and I doubted it. I'm like, this isn't really God. So, I hit rock bottom, and I didn't just climb right out. It was a long process still.
It was a roller coaster.
So you're just building some stepping stones.
Yeah, built some stepping stones there. So then 3 months after the baptism date, I went to a Wild at Heart retreat. I flew to Colorado. And
you actually went to the one with John Eldridge, right? The one that he runs? Yeah,
the one that he was speaking in live. And I went wondering what I was doing. What am I doing? I'm an atheist or agnostic, going to this Christian men's retreat. But it felt right, and it felt like I had been led there, and I tried it out. And I thought, I may come home from this vowing never to have anything to do with Christianity again, but I will try it. And it was an incredible experience, as you guys have heard. And when we did the leading saints and Wild at Heart discussion, it was an incredible experience. After about 24 hours, I still hadn't experienced God, or didn't really know. But then in one of the sessions, Jesus just came from my heart, and I cried for an hour, just strong, heavy tears for an hour. And even right after that, it wasn't just all easy, but it was a choice. What I did at that point was I chose faith. I chose over that weekend. I said, okay, I'm going to choose to believe in God now. And immediately my life turned around. My relationship with my wife turned around. And I've seen good fruit of that in the last two plus years.
That's awesome. That experience actually completely changed you in your direction in bringing that particular message of Wild at Heart to other men, right?
Oh, yeah. Really, at first I was rumbling with it. I had gone from atheist or agnostic to a Christian, not a Latter-day Saint yet, but a Christian over a weekend. And my relationships with friends, I had an atheist friend. And what do I do with that? And my dad doesn't go to church, and I had related really well with him. What do I do with that? So really, I came home from that and said, I need to go deeper with this, and I need to know how other people will respond to it. So I invited my 6 closest friends from high school to do the same thing, to go on a retreat like that with the same teachings, the same message, and see what they thought of it. They're all strong Latter-day Saints, and it was an incredible experience for all involved, and that solidified that for me that much more. And then my wife went to Captivating, and that solidified us in that direction. And in that message, and it brought us closer together too, as she accepted that.
And I was just going to clarify. So the people that haven't heard previous podcasts that we talked about, Wild at Heart is a book that was written by John Eldredge, and he created a boot camp based off of that book. And then there was also, he wrote a book with his wife, Stacy, called Captivating, which is just a beautiful book in itself as well. And I actually loved Captivating and thought it was an amazing book. But then they also created the women's retreat based off of that as well.
You got it. Yep.
So, Sarah, what kind of changes have you seen in Chris since he's become a believer in Christ and a believer in God?
Oh, that's huge. Huge changes for the better.
Compare it just to normal recovery too. Like, recovery.
Yeah.
When he was just trying to stop and not do the porn versus building a relationship with God.
Yeah, I would say on one level, there's an element of time in it. Like when he's just trying to stop and work on his own, maybe it takes 6 months to a year to dig into an issue in his past and to see it and then to feel it and then to address it and then to overcome it, kind of, except it's always going to kind of come back and haunt him. But then with God, it's like a week. And he can do that whole process in a week. And then I think the change is deeper and it just extends out into every part of our life. Or another example, maybe a specific example, is through our whole marriage, we've struggled with his parenting. So, I did a lot of therapy, and I even worked for a therapy camp for rebellious teenagers. And so I have an idea of how I want to parent our kids. And all throughout recovery in this process, he would do things that hurt his relationship with our son and made the problem worse instead of better. And so he's working on it, and I would talk to him about it, and it's like he could never get it. And just in the last couple of years with God, he can get it, and he can even see it for himself because God can show it to him. And so God can show him what's going on. He can see it, and God can change his heart, and he can correct it. And I don't need to direct it all. And I think it's lasting and real.
That's awesome. Now, I know that in one of the things you talked about some key principles that you talked about vulnerability, and then going upstream. We talked a little bit about that. You talked about including God, and I want to ask you. So most addicts will pray to God and to be able to help them stop the addiction. But what is the difference there that you're talking about with including God in your recovery that you're talking about with one of your key principles?
Yeah, I think I was thinking, as Sarah shared, there's an element, a strong element of humility that I think as an agnostic, when I was agnostic, I was always repelling, and did not have that humility. But with addiction, I think there's a lot of humility. The more humility I've got, I'll come and ask for help. And I'm learning to do that with God. I've learned to go to God for validation, which is a big thing. Without God in the picture, where do I go to say, okay, I'm enough. I am okay. I am worthy. I go to accomplishments, or I go to how I'm doing, whether I'm acting out, whether people like me. And with God in the picture, with God as my Father, I go to Him for validation. I go to God and say, do you love me? Am I okay? And then that's enough. Once I have that in my heart, the other agitations just ripple away, or what would you say? Yeah. They just don't matter as much. I can also share like that conversation that I had with God. That first journaled conversation was so. There was so much love in it. So I think addicts struggle to feel loved. I struggled as an addict to feel loved and to feel connection to anybody or anything. And God offers connection and love and abundance. Reaching out to God from when he wasn't real didn't solve that for me, didn't help me, and didn't help me through addiction at all. And that's why early in recovery, I felt like I didn't need religion anymore, because it hadn't helped me. But once God was real, once I was connecting with him, it allowed me to get that cup filled of the fatherly love, the validation that I needed.
Yeah. Sarah, I would love so when Chris shared the story about the baptizing his son, you kind of were like, I would say that differently. So I would love to hear from your perspective, just that whole story, why you felt like you needed to put your foot down there and be like, nope, you can't baptize your own son. Like, that's pretty heavy.
Yeah, I think the bottom line was the timing, but it was also that, my son had actually not wanted to get baptized for a while, and I was intent on honoring that, but also I know God is real, and I have a testimony of the restoration of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So I wanted him to make that choice for himself. So I had spent, a year praying about how to teach my son, how to change his heart, so that he would choose to get baptized for himself. And he had. I think it took about 6 months of God just giving me little things to say and little things to teach. And at some point, my son came to me and said he wanted to get baptized. But my husband is an atheist, right? So he's not really supportive. So we talked to him, and because it was sincere, Chris agreed to it.
Because my son.
Because our son's choice was sincere in his own, Chris agreed to it, which I'm grateful for, even though he didn't want that for himself. But, then I did make it clear that Chris could, explore and engage with God and get there, but he chose not to. And then the morning of, he comes in and says, I think I can do it. And what was in my heart was, no way, this is not real. It's not sincere. You don't know God and you don't believe in it. And
that he was doing more out of an obligation, that he was trying to do it as he was obligated to do it.
Or was he doing it like as a Pharisee, like just to be seen?
Yeah, for himself. Like he didn't want to just not do it. So then it was like kind of out of fear or out of his own, poser maybe. So it's like he was going to show up for his son, except he wasn't actually showing up for his son. And what I felt like is that if he came to it from that agnostic, doubtful, like I'm posing place, that would hurt my son's experience. So I felt like I was defending my son's experience by saying, no, it's too late. I'm going to protect what he has chosen and prepared for.
And I think he was just right. I'll accept that. My son had an incredible experience that day, and it's a landmark spiritual experience for him. And it was my spiritual rock bottom, allowing me to get there. I'm grateful.
Which is awesome that experience changed you.
Yeah.
Yes.
May I add, you can choose if you like it or not, but may I add that was the second worst day in our entire marriage. I was so mad at him. I didn't talk to him. And I had never done that before or since to Chris, for kind of, flipping at the last minute and making me stand up in between him and our son, rather than doing what was best for our son. I was so mad. And actually, in that anger, it had been hard for so long. And I remember God telling me this is his rock bottom. And I thought, man, it's awful, but it doesn't feel like rock bottom. But then it was. So it was worth it.
Chris, was that the worst day for you too? Or did you realize that it was a bad day? Or
I've had a lot of bad days.
Yeah.
Not because of her, but because of the addiction, because of days where I just felt like I had to have sex, right? And it's just not going to happen, under those circumstances. For example, I've had a lot of bad days.
Let's see. So Chris and Sarah, in what areas do you continue to struggle or face your biggest challenges in recovery? Sarah, where do you struggle in your recovery?
With my own or in relationship to pornography addiction, or
just, in your own life, like, in your own recovery, as far as like living with an addict or,
where do I struggle? I don't know how this will come across, but the hardest thing for me is standing up with strength to my husband and not blaming myself for it afterward. So there are times when I feel I'm coming to understand that it's from God, but it feels harsh or angry, or, when I say, Chris, you need to change. This is unacceptable and you have to change it, and you have to change it now. And it's hard for me to say that and not tell myself, like, I guess I give in to the adversary telling me, like, you shouldn't have said that. You're being too mean. You're not being Christ-like, all those lies. But the truth is that the holy place is when I go back to God and he says, that was just right. This is hard. Stick with it.
So holding to boundaries is tough sometimes for you then. Setting and holding boundaries might be tough. Is that another way of saying that?
I guess what I mean to be saying is that I prefer to be kind and gentle and say things like, hey, Chris, this isn't working very well. Like, will you think about this? And instead, when I do that, Chris ignores it, especially if he's, acting out or in drama or, in that mindset. Like, he just ignores it. It makes no impact. So I have to get very strong and assertive to make a difference, to get his attention.
Like with the baptism day.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's an awareness for you. You talked a little bit in your in the information you sent to us before that you had an awareness of what Chris has gone through, and with lots of recovery, and you knew the difference between the recovered man and the addict. Do you want to expand on that a little bit about how that related to you and what you guys were going through?
Yeah. Well, so now in hindsight, I've learned to really tell the difference between the recovered man and the addict. And in Chris's case, his addict initially showed up, way back when he was white knuckling before LifeStar. It showed up as him falling asleep when I talked to him, kind of not being aware, not really following conversations, not really engaging in home life, or, like if something breaks or something needs to be fixed or addressed, he's just kind of checked out, and then I get to figure out what to do. So kind of that. And then even in recovery, there were a lot of things like he's not as compassionate or as considerate. Like, he'll say things kind of harsh, or he'll even sometimes say things that he knows will hurt me. Or what are the other? Oh man. And the biggest is when I'll say, hey, that hurt me. Like, what's going on for you? You probably have some emotions. He'll get angry. He'll be like, no, I'm fine. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, look at all these things I've done that make me fine. And so that's defensiveness, right? And maybe even blaming me instead of humility and looking at his stuff. So the contrast is the recovered man When I say something like that, like, hey, something's going on, that wasn't very nice, he'll say, oh, let me go check that out. And he'll just go pray about it. And he'll come back and say, yeah, you're right, this thing bothered me. And it's so simple and so easy to work things out. Or he'll notice things around the house and take initiative in fixing it or addressing it or dealing with it. Or he'll parent our children with patience and kindness and love instead of kind of just wanting to get it over with and get it fixed, and just get them to stop acting out. And those are some. That's what's on the top of my head.
Awesome. And you also mentioned that you don't trust him, but you trust God. Yeah,
especially early in recovery. Because he wasn't trustworthy. And especially when he hadn't gone through recovery, he didn't know himself. Like just like when we met and he said, oh, my family's great. But then as he went through therapy, he discovered that there were wounds that needed to be addressed. So it's like he didn't even know himself. So he wasn't trustworthy. I could come to him and say, hey, I think you're struggling. And he would tell me all the reasons he wasn't struggling, but that wasn't truthful. So the truthful place for me was to go to God and say, God, I think he's struggling. What do you want me to do about it? And God would tell me, or Chris would blame me and I could go to God and say, hey, God, this is what Chris said. What do you want me to do about it? And God would tell me. And so I could trust God and trust God for what I needed to do and what I needed to do in relationship with Chris and not trust Chris.
So Chris, tell us a little bit about your relationship with God now. How do you feel about him?
My relationship with God has changed my life and continues to change my life. I've experienced him in incredible ways. I've experienced patience and love, and support and guidance. I've experienced the right thing happening at the right time. I've experienced I've experienced the wrong thing happening at the right time. And there have been a few things in my journey where I was resisting and not moving forward. And through Sarah's prayers and God's abundance, I got the push that I needed to keep moving forward, to take the next step. And I just I wake up every morning and I deliberately spend 1 to 2 hours seeking connection with God, because it's so important. It's important for my heart. It's important for me as a parent and a spouse. And it's important for me in my continuing recovery, my continuing repentance and going further and further upstream to heal the older and older wounds and things that are still getting in the way. God is a partner now. God is a friend. God is a father. And I'm incredibly grateful.
So what would you say to any of our listeners who are out there who are maybe in the place where you were at, where it's like, yeah, I'm mad at God, or maybe he's just not even there, and I don't know if this is all worth it. And what would you say to even old Chris or some of our other addicts who might be and
new
listeners
to recovery?
who might be kind of in that place right now?
Yeah. Thank you for that question. It's so important. And when I used to counsel, recovering addicts, informally as a friend, and I never would include God. And I would say, reach out to men, or read this book or do this. And now I would lead with find God. If you want to recover, find God, reach out to God and connect with him. And that's and then follow him. I would, to old Chris, or to anyone who's, doubting God, I would say separate the church or religion from God. Like, this is really important. And this was the grace that God gave to me, because I grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but I found God through a non-denominational retreat. And it was so good for me to find God separate from church or from religion, to just find that God is real, separate from when I go to church, that God comes into my heart. Jesus cares and loves and will heal me as I open up to him, as I reach out to him, as I allow him into my life. So first, separate religion from God, and then go find God. And he's available. Reach out to whoever you can, whatever you can. A Wild at Heart retreat is an incredible way to do that. I'm very aggressive about inviting people to those now. I'm leading my fourth one this month, and the fourth one I've led. And every single time, most of the men are members of the Church of Latter-day Saints, Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we're not trying to pull them away from the church. We're trying to lead them to God, and they find God in that setting. But I know a man that I just talked to today who said 3 years ago he saw that he was in a rut, and he just decided to start reading his scriptures, getting up early every morning and reading his scriptures. And one day he found that he had been reading for 2 hours and just loved it. And then the more he read the scriptures, the more he wanted to pray, and he found God. Like, there are so many paths to God. Find God, even if it's separate from Christianity. Find God first, and then he'll lead you the rest of the way.
Can I go back a question?
Absolutely.
Yep. Oh man, and this is a vulnerable thing. But you asked what issues are still here in our marriage now, right?
Yeah.
That was a question ago. And I wanted to say sex is still a difficult issue that we're working on. And it's especially hard because I grew up with sexual trauma, and Chris grew up with with his sex addiction. And so how do you disentangle that?
And we're actually going to talk a little bit more about that in the bonus content too, because we wanted to go into more detail about that.
Yeah. So what we usually do with our guests is we ask them if there's a song that has, been meaningful for them in their recovery and in bringing them closer to God, or meaningful in their recovery. And so if you guys had to pick a song to send our listeners out with, what would that be?
I would say Dancing in the Minefields by
Andrew Peterson. That's when I was...
because it's so crazy hard, and especially navigating the addiction and especially recovery, right? Like, I feel like recovery got a whole lot worse before it got lots better. So maybe it got a lot worse before it got a lot better. And so it's just ups and downs like mines. And we're just trying to navigate our way through it and stick together and create a beautiful marriage. But then there's bombs ready to go off all the time, everywhere. Yeah. And we're trying to figure that out. And in fact, for our 10-year wedding anniversary, we inscribed, "We do hard things" on the insides of our rings. And it fits with that song that we commit to sticking it through, even though it's hard, because it will get better.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah. So Dancing in the Minefields by Andrew Peterson. So we'll finish out with that song. To our subscribers, to the outsiders, you're bold, accepted, unashamed. We love you. Thank you. If you have not subscribed, Sarah, please go ahead and subscribe to our podcast. Social media, join us on social media at Unashamed Unafraid. To our listeners, if you have a story to share, We would love to hear from you. Particularly, we would love to hear from, we've had requests for stories from those who are divorced and are now, what that has been like, or for those of you who are single and struggling with addiction, and you ladies out there, if there's any women out there that are struggling from addiction, we've had requests through our anonymous questions to hear podcasts from you as well.
So reach out to us, email us.
Absolutely.
Chris, James, Steve, CT, Jason, anybody at unashamed.unafraid.com.
And so with that, we'll send everybody out with Dancing in the Minefields.
Well, I was 19, you were 21. The year we got engaged. And everyone said we were much too young, but we did it anyway. We got the rings for 40 each from a pawn shop down the road. And we said our vows and took the leap now 15 years ago. We went dancing in the minefields. We went sailing in the storms. And it was harder than we dreamed, but I believe that's what the promise is for. Well, I do are the two most famous last words, the beginning of the end. But to lose your life for another, I've heard, is a good place to begin. 'Cause the only way to find your life is to lay your own life down. And I believe it's an easy price for the life that we have found. And we're dancing in the minefields. We're sailing in the storms. And this is harder than we dreamed, but I believe that's what the promise is for. That's what the promise is for. So when I lose my way, find me. And when I lose love's chains, bind me at the end of all my faith, to the end of all my days. When I forget my name, remind me. 'Cause we bear the light of the Son of Man, so there's nothing left to fear. So I'll walk with you in the shadowlands till the shadows disappear. 'Cause he promised not to leave us, and his promises are true. So in the face of all this chaos, maybe I can dance with you. So let's go dancing in the